Welcome to the Grow Strong Leaders podcast. I'm your host, Meredith Bell, and I interview business leaders who are committed to their own growth and the development of everyone on their team. If you enjoy my podcast, be sure to subscribe and rate it on your favorite podcast platform. Welcome back to another episode of the Grow Strong Leaders podcast. I want to start by sharing a very surprising statistic. Harvard published the results of a survey of 17,000 managers, and one of the questions they asked the managers was this: when did you experience your first formal leadership training? You want to take a guess at their answer before I tell you? I was shocked to learn that the average age was 42. What would happen if we started with children instead of waiting until someone is so far into their career before they learn the basics about leadership? Well, you don't have to wonder what would happen, because my guest today has focused on teaching leadership to young people for almost 20 years. I'm excited to welcome Dr. Alan Nelson to my show. Hi, Alan.
Hey, Meredith. So nice to be on your program. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, I am just beyond excited about the conversation we're going to be having because of your expertise in this area. I know that a lot of my listeners are parents or even grandparents like I am now. And what you have to share is really important for them in interacting with the young people in their lives. So this is just going to be such a valuable conversation with them, I know. Let me tell them a little bit about you. Alan is the founder of KidLead Academy, the world's first online course to train parents how to develop their child's leadership potential. Alan has been passionate about leadership throughout his career. He's the author of 40 books and over 200 articles on personal growth and leadership. He has a doctorate in leadership from the University of San Diego and has taught leadership courses at several universities, including USC's Marshall School of Business and the Naval Postgraduate School. We're going to focus our conversation today on his book for parents, which I have right here, and I love this book. It's called My Kid Leads, a how-to book for parents wanting to raise future leaders today. I highly recommend that you get a copy of this for yourself and for any parent that you really care about. It's amazing, the information in there. So, Alan, before we jump into the book, I want you to talk a little bit about your journey from leadership in organizations, which is something you focused on for quite a while, and then you shifted to developing leadership in children. How did that transition happen?
Well, I had a doctorate in leadership, and I was always intrigued by how people lead, what made people follow other people and do things. Historically, sometimes they do heinous things, right? Terrible things. But I've always been intrigued by that. So usually when you get a doctorate in the field, you go into consulting or being a professor and writing books, etc. But at midlife, Meredith, someday you'll get to midlife. And my dad used to say, life is like a roll of toilet paper. The less you have left, the faster it goes. So at midlife, I got to this half a roll left, and I said, man, what do I want to do with my life? In that I could go into more of what I'd been doing, or I could pivot. And so, through a process of talking to some people, one of whom was a futurist, he said, have you ever thought about kids? And I said, well, yeah, I got three of my own, right? But I never really thought of leadership in kids. So I started doing some research early on to see what was out there, and I found that really nothing in a concentrated area had been done to teach organizational leadership, right? Things that, Meredith, but that a lot of people, when you work with youth, when they talk about leadership, they talk about self-esteem, character, uh, you know, service, all good stuff, but it's not what we teach executives. So I said, who's teaching them to lead that way. No one. So that started that journey. And for the first 2 or 3 years, I thought, I don't know if these kids can learn. But when I we started putting them in activities with each other and watching them and observing them and learning, we said, oh my gosh, they are amazing leaders. And some of them were so gifted. I mean, before the program, you were telling me of a story of your granddaughter. Maybe you're going to tell it, but examples like that, you observe these kids and you say, okay, that kid knows how to lead. Just like any talent, you need to nurture it, development, but you want to give them a head start, right? 42 is way past the time when our neuroplasticity is elevated. We can learn. It's really ROI on adult leadership training is really low, right? It takes a lot of energy to see results. So that's my audacious goal, is to identify leaders, to help parents identify leaders, and then develop them. So that's my journey in a nutshell.
I love that. And yeah, I'll quickly fill in because one of the key points you make in your book that I don't think enough people think of is this idea of being able to recognize leadership talent early on. And I was surprised, but in a way, but then when I looked at my own granddaughter, I know it's not really that surprising. You were saying you can see leadership qualities emerge even in preschool children. And the story I was telling you was we were at the playground with them, and there was a piece of equipment where, and she's 10 now, where she was organizing kids to make this into a train and taking tickets, and she was the train conductor. And one of the mothers that was there watching her came over to us and said, you know, she's going to be a CEO someday. And I just laughed because that is her nature to, organize people, persuade them, and do so much of the leadership attributes that you're going to be talking about. The good news is, no matter where the kids are, there are leadership elements that can be developed in all of them. But just like someone has natural born talent for a sport or a musical instrument or art, we can see some of these natural leadership qualities. And so, one of the points you make in your book is around whether leaders are born or made. And I would love for you to speak to that point. What did you conclude about that question?
Well, if you Google that question, are leaders made or born, born or made, you'll find millions and millions of results. So it is one of those, chicken or egg questions that people are just intrigued about. So the evolution is that in history, we pretty much thought that you were either born to be a leader or you weren't. You were born with nobility or a blue blood or whatever, and it was just a few select people. But then with the rise of democratization and heightened education, now most people, I can't speak for the whole world, but certainly in the Western society and beyond, we realize that, wow, a lot more people can be leaders than we thought. And now we buy into the idea, at least in the US culture, anyone can be a leader. Well, that sounds really egalitarian and really positive. But at the end of the day, the last 10 to 20 years, we've learned a lot from genetic research. And we've learned that some traits, depending on what traits you look at, anywhere from 10% to 60% are basically genetic. And so it doesn't mean that kids cannot learn how to lead, but some are predispositioned to lead. So just like your granddaughter, I guarantee you she didn't at age 10 say, "Oh, I'm going to start doing this." Probably, she was doing that 3, 4, 5, right? So there are certain kids that just naturally they feel comfortable, and those are, as you mentioned, those are the kids that we want to get in early to sort of heightened preparation because just like it, whether they're a gymnast, a soccer player, a singer, art, or even academics, right? We want to prepare them in an advanced way. And what happens is, though, we just don't do that. So really, it's both and. Are leaders born or made? Yes, the answer is yes. So some have a predisposition, and we ought to start that young. Some do not have a predisposition, but as they grow in their social emotional development, they can learn leadership skills. So again, it's one of those things where some have talent, some do not. What's interesting is that in the late 60s, Congress went to what is now the Department of Education and said, hey, what are we doing to develop our most talented people, right? Because it was the Cold War. We were concerned about China and Russia getting a jump on us. So Dr. Marlin put together the Marlin Report and presented it to Congress and included in including academic talent, they also recognize the gifted and talented kids in the area of leadership. And so even today, in the United States Department of Education, it recognizes leadership as part of the gifted and talented program. It's just that schools focus on academics, they don't focus on leadership. So what we want to do at KidLead is kind of look for those kids who are gifted and talented in the area of leading and help parents and educators develop them.
And what have you found to be the age range that works that you focus your attention on because you see that you can get the best results and involvement?
Yeah, so we have a whole age and stage curricula. It's called Lead Young Training Systems, and we developed this around typical, um, developmental programs. And so we have one for preschoolers, one for 6 to 9, one for 10 to 13, and one for 14 and up. So your granddaughter, who just turned 10, she's at the beginning of the bullseye. I believe, the bullseye is ages 10 to 13 because by 10 years old, they have a certain socio emotional intelligence and development, but they also have a cognitive jump, right? They're more cognitive. They're not conceptual thinkers yet, but their cognitions elevate. So the 10 to 13 window, we call it, is what I think is the bullseye because they're still pliable in their character too. As we get older, we can always change in our character, but it just takes a lot more input for the results. But still, as kids, they're still more impressionable, and we can change some bad habits. And I think that's the time to get them not only to be effective, but also to be ethical.
Well, it may seem obvious, but what have you seen to be the benefits of focusing on youth for leadership development in terms of their evolution? You've been doing this for a while, so you've probably seen or have some data over what impact your programs make on them as they get older and go into the workforce.
So the professor side of me doesn't want to overstate what we've seen, right? It's anecdotal because we don't have a large population, a large sampling size. Having said that, though, we definitely have some very strong testimonial and anecdotal results. Let me give you just a couple. One of them is a trainer up in Canada who's been using this since 2009, 2010. She was an early adopter. And so she has seen their middle schoolers go through high school and then go into college. And true story, I kid you not, the president of this college that was receiving some of their high school grads said, what in the world is this group doing? And so he found out who it was and literally called her up and said, what are you doing to the kids? And they were in a faith community. What are you doing to kids in your faith community? Because when they come into college, they are just great leaders. So she smiled and said, well, it's because we start them when they're 10, right? And then all through high school, they get development. So first of all, you get noticed because they're confident and they are not in a sort of cocky, pompous way, but they're comfortable being in charge. And then we piloted this program also in Eaton, Colorado. And so that lady there, Nina Lewis, she's been a trainer for the years, and she said many of those kids now, when they leave Eaton, they become the first regional manager in their company. Some of them are actually leading their companies. So she gives testimony to literally dozens of kids who now, as young adults, are way ahead of the rest because they got a head start. I sometimes say I could beat Usain Bolt in a race if you just gave me a big enough head start. And so that's what we're trying to do is to help parents, grandparents, educators give these young leaders a head start so that by 42, they're not just formally learning, they are teaching others how to lead like them.
Right. Well, I'm sure my listeners who are parents are probably curious. What are some things that they could look for in their kids that would help them identify, does my child have this natural leadership ability already? I think that would be really helpful to hear those key attributes, if you will, that they could look for.
Great question. So when we began looking at these sort of symptoms of leadership talent, we looked at adult assessments, and there are dozens and dozens, as you know, Meredith. There are dozens of assessments you can give to executives and adults, but most of those are how to lead better, how to lead more effectively. We weren't interested in finding out how to lead more effectively as we were on emerging leadership talent. And we found that there are four distinct things that young leaders have that others do not have, but it's required for them to lead. Okay. And we put them into an alliteration so that they all have the same beginning. So it's persuasion, propelled, planner, and power. And so by being persuasive, meaning they're good at selling, just like your granddaughter, right? She makes up this game and then she says, okay, I'm the conductor, right? Because they almost always put themselves in charge. Let's play school. I'll be the teacher. You sit there, you sit there. So they're persuading them to follow in their game. And you can see that on the playground. Some kids, when they say, hey, let's play Red Rover, boop, everyone follows them. Another kid would say, hey, let's play baseball. No one goes, right? And it's a little bit sad, but it's a reality that some people just get followed more than others. So leaders are always persuading, they're always selling. So it's the child who comes to you and says, hey, Mom, Dad, I want to stay up and watch the Disney movie, right? And they say, no, it's a school night. It's past your bedtime. Hey, my clothes are laid out. I got my lunch. My homework's done. And it's not the kid having a hissy fit on aisle two at Walmart. It's the kid who just lets you know that this is a good idea. So you say, okay. And they close the door on their way out and you say, how do they always do this? Right? So they're just good at negotiating. Um, and and that's a very important trait. Another quality is they're propelled, meaning they're self-motivated. It's not the kid watching hour after hour of TV or video game. They always like to be doing projects. Even if they like video games, they're organizing a competition with their friends. And they're saying, okay, come over, we're gonna, do this, and here's the prize. So they just naturally motivated. A third thing is the planner. They're good at organizing. Just again, like your granddaughter, she organized people. So it takes two skill sets. It takes big picture thinking. Here's what we want to do, and then it takes small strategic planning. Here's how we're going to do it. So usually people are good at one or the other, but leaders have to be good at both. And then power means they're comfortable being in charge. And even preschoolers, we noticed behaviors. We ran this program that we were learning about them in Silicon Valley, right? And the school, I would go to the preschool and I say, are certain kids leaders? They say, oh, are they leaders? And they usually like to be teachers' helpers. And I said, well, helping isn't necessarily a leader trait. And they said, no, they like to be the teacher helper because they are seen with the teacher as kind of an authority figure, a power figure. And that's common. And sometimes schools don't like these kids who are power oriented because they'll push back on a teacher or even administration if they think something isn't fair. And they'll stand up to them. And they'll stand up to a bully, they'll stand up to an unfairness. And so they seem to have a comfort zone and or they put themselves into power positions like your granddaughter. I'll be the conductor, okay? Or I'll be the teacher. You sit there, you sit there. So that's those four things when they're together. See, you can be persuasive and not a leader. You can be self-motivated and not be a leader, but when you do it together. So all four of these together, when you see these four qualities, guaranteed you have a budding leader on your hand. And you ought to develop them early to lead, not just to be a follower and hope that someday corporate America will teach them how to lead.
I'm smiling so much because as you're talking, I was thinking back to other things I know about my granddaughter, but also my daughter and also me. When I think back to when I was in fifth grade, I was
Yes,
the teacher's helper.
yes,
And it was fun. And I had never thought about it the way you were describing in terms of it seems like it's inconsistent. Well, if you want to be the helper, then you're not the leader, but that association with being perceived as um, with the person in authority and and I think making a contribution. I think there is that element of wanting to make a difference that
yep,
also is
yep,
driving people who have that leadership tendency. And you mentioned fairness. It was so funny. This mother that came over and said, "Oh, she's going to be a CEO." She said, "It isn't just because she's taking charge. She has a real sense of fairness, of making sure all the kids get a turn." So I think that is such an important trait that we sometimes lose sight of when we think of effective leadership. The stereotype, if you will, somebody that takes charge, but isn't necessarily concerned about everybody's well-being.
right,
But I
right.
think that you can see that also in the younger kids when you notice, are they paying attention to how other people are feeling, responding, reacting to this? And I would love for you to explore of those four, when you think about adults in the workplace, and my listeners, many of whom are in leadership roles themselves, are there things with the employees on their teams that they can be noticing or looking for? What's the translation of what you just said about kids that would apply to the workplace?
Well, let me continue this conversation also by suggesting that if you have a child, we have an assessment. It's free, it's online. You can go to leadyoungtraining.com, and I'm sure it'll be in the show notes.
Yes.
But you can, there's one just for preschoolers because we notice preschool behavior is a little bit different as they get older. There's one for basically 6 through 18. And we also have an adult version. I wrote a book called The Five-Star Boss. It's designed for new bosses, first-time bosses, right? Because we a lot of these young leaders, when they go to the workplace, now they're seen as a manager or boss, and what do I do, right? So I wrote this book for that. And so we have one for adults that adults can take as well, either on themselves or someone can take it on them. But I think when you're an adult looking for someone who can take over or be in charge of a team, you look for those four qualities. But I think you're also looking for someone who maybe, and I want to say this in the right way, but maybe you butt heads with a little bit, okay? Because sometimes those strong-willed young employees are actually just budding leaders because leaders have opinions it's not that they want to take over or are disrespectful, but they have ways that if they were in charge, they would do things, right? So I think you give them little projects to be in charge of. You say, hey, Nancy, I want you to run this project, run this team. And then you just watch how they do it. You don't need to micromanage because that's a trust issue and leaders like to figure it out themselves. So you give them some rein. You don't want to put them in a box. You want to give the thoroughbred some reins to run, right? And then you let them run with it. And then you debrief. You say, hey, how'd things go? What were some sticking points? If you're going to do it again, what would you do differently next time? And those are the people that will eventually either replace you or you can put in charge. But I think they get overlooked or they get perceived, just like in schools, they get perceived as troublemakers. And they're really not troublemakers. They're trying to help, but you see them as a threat. And I think that's a big thing. A lot of times schools, and I'm in higher ed, so I'm pro education. But schools by nature are not leader developers. They actually tend to thwart leadership in young people because compliance, because public education is a large group. You have to have compliance. We get that. But leaders by nature are non-compliant. So what happens when you come home and you stub your toe on a nail in the carpet? You go get a hammer and you pound that nail down. So a lot of schools inadvertently pound down their leaders, and a lot of the kids who go to the principal's office are just budding CEOs, right? Someday they're gonna run the country or run the corporation, but we don't see that. And I found out about 25% of teachers, they see that. They get that and they harness the social influence of their leaders. About 75% of educators, they don't like those kids because they don't know how to handle them and they end up stealing attention away from the teacher that they want. Same thing in companies. Sometimes leaders or people in authority roles who may not lead, right? They just have authority. Sometimes they get threatened by the new hire or the young people who really have natural leadership talent, as opposed to seeing them how they can tap into what they bring. They squish them and they put them down. They see them as toxic or competitive or non-compliant, and they're threatened by them. And so they try to get rid of them or squelch them.
I hear that from a number of people. And the sad thing with the young folks coming into the workplace today, they won't tolerate that for
No,
long.
they
They'll
don't, do they?
leave.
No.
Different generations react differently. They might have that same internal response, but their behavior response will be quite a bit different.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Are you sharing any information with teachers? Are they part of your circle of influence? I know the book we're talking about today, My Kid Leads, is geared to parents, but it certainly does apply for teachers as well, just to raise their awareness about what leadership looks like in a young person.
We try that. To be honest, when we began this, Kid Lead officially began in 2009, after about 4 or 5 years of prototyping and piloting. And we said, oh, the nonprofit sector, education, faith community, civic groups, they're going to love this, right? Because they have youth. Excuse me. My wife said, yeah, you ought to begin with parents. Well, I was hesitant because I said, so sorry. I said, hey, we want to go with the masses. So we tried that for about 15 years. And then, oh, I got a tickle. I'm sorry, Meredith. Just finished teaching for 3 hours.
That'll
So
do it.
we so we tried to take it to schools and such. They liked it, but they felt like they had too much on their plate. They just didn't have any bandwidth, and I understood that. But I think at the same time, people who go into education, they love kids, they help kids, but they're themselves not leaders for the most part. They're teachers. They're not trained to lead. And I think there just wasn't the value there. And so then the pandemic happened, school shut down, faith community shut down. So what do we do now? And then a little over a year ago, I was diagnosed with cancer, prostate cancer, and so all of that sped up my clock. And I said, okay, you know, I don't know how long at the time. I said, I don't know how long I have, and the educational systems are not just opening the doors. So I said, let's go to parents. And all along, my wife is saying, I told you that from the start, right? So it's one of those life lessons, and we still laugh about it. So my wife said, I was right. I said, no, you were right. Because no one's more interested in developing their kids than parents. That's why we've pivoted. We've decided to, teach parents how to identify leadership talent, how to develop their child's leadership talent. And then everything we do, we're open for educators to learn, but we're really targeting parents because parents, just like you as a grandparent, you see those behaviors in everyday life and you say, oh my gosh, they can lead.
Oh, let's do explore, I think for our remaining time, things that parents can do. And there were different chapters you had in your book that I just, because of my own work with leaders and organizations, I thought this is so cool to think in terms of doing this with children. So one of them was around self-discipline, because of course, young children don't have that. Some adults still don't. But when we think about kids, and what are some practical things that parents can do to help them learn how to manage themselves, manage their behavior, manage their time, you know, just everything that falls under that whole realm of self-discipline.
So self-discipline, self-control depends on whatever you call it. Delay of gratification. Obviously, working with adults that adults need it, but adults don't always have it. Sometimes they're impulsive, and an impulsive leader is dangerous, right? History is full of examples. So we want all kids to be self-disciplined, but we definitely want leaders to learn self-discipline because they have influence. So I think if we're not seeing that in our child, the bottom line is we want to reward desired behavior. So that's the strongest motivator. When we see our child doing something they don't want to do, how can we reward it? I think you may have heard of the marshmallow experiment,
But yeah.
very famous, but the early investigators that started, I think, at Stanford University, now the professor is at Columbia, I believe, but they put a marshmallow on a table and they bring in some kids and they would say, hey, if you want to eat this marshmallow, you can. Or if you wait until the research person comes back into the room, we'll give you two marshmallows. If you don't eat it, we'll give you two. So what's interesting is that some of the kids, they would look at it, they would poke it. Some of the kids would eat it, and some of them would not eat it. And then when the researcher came back in 10 or 15 minutes, they would get two. So then they would get two treats. And it wasn't always marshmallows, it was sometimes cookies or something they would like. Well, here's what's interesting is they followed up years later, 5, 10, 15, 20 years later, with these same kids. The kids who ate the marshmallows right away also struggled as students. They had lesser jobs, and sometimes their turnover at jobs was much higher than those who waited, who got better grades, ended up with better jobs, and stayed in their jobs longer. So the point is that what we learn as kids does have long-term effects. So the idea is to how can we reward our kids more when they delay gratification? So let's say we say, hey, I want you to clean your room. I'll give you time on the game. I'll give you money. I'll give you whatever would kind of be an incentive for the child. But if you do it right away, I'll give you twice as much, right? So you make the reward, you compensate the reward for delay or to do something they don't like first. So it can work both ways, but those little incremental training that helps them to learn that discipline is a muscle, and like all muscles, they need to be exercised. If we don't exercise that, if we just let our kids do whatever they want, we ask them to clean their room, and a week later it's not clean. We haven't helped them to succeed in an area that's very important for life. It's crucial for leadership.
I was just thinking about for those whose kids maybe don't care about if they get to watch TV longer or some of the traditional rewards that we might come up with. What do you do when the child doesn't seem to care or be motivated by some of those external rewards? Is there some other way to help them acquire that self-control?
I think there are always things that motivate, right? At USC, I taught a graduate course on human capital and motivation, and I was amazed how many different ways to motivate there are. But traditionally, we think of just a few: money, time off. Everyone is motivated, but you just are motivated in different areas. So, for example, the employee who is just like this, this lug, right? This sloth at work. As soon as it's 5 o'clock, they run to their truck and then they run to the ball diamond because they love their co-ed softball team. Well, were they motivated? Work, no. Softball, yes. So the question is, what motivates my staff? What motivates my kids? So I think kind of what we're doing in this class of KidLead Academy is we're kind of helping the parent think as a leader, your company, maybe it's a company of two people, your spouse and your kid, or maybe you have two kids, your company of four people, you need to lead it. So, just as a good boss, a good manager will learn motivation techniques for their staff, you need to learn motivation techniques for your kids and even for your spouse. So, what would motivate them, right? So, just because you haven't found it doesn't mean that they're unmotivated. It just means you haven't found that key yet.
And what that suggests to me is parents really getting to know their kids well,
Yeah.
spending time with them to see what is it that really makes them tick? What is it that makes them light up and they really are eager to spend time on and what's important to them? So that's an important piece, I think, because different children are motivated just like adults by
Yep.
different things. And so you can't use the same leverage point necessarily with the same two kids.
Yeah.
So
For example, sometimes as parents, we'll ask our kid, "Hey, did you have a good day today?" That's a yes, no answer. And then we wonder why they don't tell us about their day. A better question would be, "Hey, what was one cool thing about your day?" Now, all of a sudden, they tell about, recess, or they tell about a project they did. And so sometimes we set ourselves up to fail because we don't ask good questions, right? We just ask simple questions and we get mumble responses. But I guarantee you that whether it's a new game or whether it's a new subject or whether it's a new friend, I guarantee you that there are some motivators that child has. We just need to re-articulate ourselves, ask better questions, set them up to converse with us as opposed to just be that typical person who has headphones on, mumbling in the back seat.
well, one of the other chapters that I really liked that is so important for adult life is this ability to have critical thinking, to, anticipate consequences for what they do.
Yeah.
And again, what would you see as areas or opportunities for parents to help give children the chance to develop those critical skills?
I think there's a trend these days, Meredith, that we as parents confuse coddling our kids with care. Care means I want what's best for my child, which means I want them to be confident. I want them to be critical thinkers, problem solvers, decision makers. But when we coddle them, when we keep them in the house because we're afraid that they play outside, they may get hurt, we bubble wrap them, and bubble wrap kids don't make good leaders and they make bad employees. So that means we need to let them be in charge. So, for example, one of the things we do in our course is we train parents to do at home, in the neighborhood projects where the child is actually leading it. So it could be a child or preteen or teen, and their project is commensurate with their ability and their age, right? So, for example, you might say, "Hey, Joey, you're in charge of dinner Thursday night." Well, in the old way, we'd say Joey, you're in charge of dinner means Joey has to make dinner. But in a leadership mindset, you'd say, "Joey, you're in charge of mealtime Thursday." That means you need to figure out what we're going to eat, who's going to cook it, who's going to clean up, when we're all going to be available. And so, sure enough, Joey has to do that. Joey may not touch a stitch of food or touch anything, but he's in charge of it. So now he has to employ critical thinking skills. Oh, well, we need food. Do we have the food in the house? If we don't have it in the house, how are we going to get it? Maybe mom or dad give them a budget to work with. Oh, now I got to figure out, if we go to McDonald's, it's going to cost this. And so all of a sudden now they're in charge of the project of getting people fed in their family Thursday night. So that moves from just being a chore teaching them to cook to a leadership opportunity where they have to think critically. So a lot of times parents, well-meaning parents, give their children the answer as opposed to helping them think critically. So I think of my granddaughters and I watch this and I talk about it in the book or I talk about it in the training. I saw them as young kids. I think they were like one was 3 and one was 5. or one was 4 and one was 2. And they had this little climbing apparatus in their home. He works for Duke University, so they do everything real cerebral. And I think, oh my gosh, you're a much better parent than I was. So their little daughter, Juniper, our granddaughter, is climbing, gets to the top, and she gets scared, right? Because she's at the top of this little ladder and she doesn't know how to get down. So a normal parent, when she said, Dad, help me, a normal parent would say, okay, picked her up and put her down. But Jeff said, no, wait, Juniper. He said, come up with 2 or 3 strategies of how you can get down from here. And I thought, that is brilliant, right? And so Juniper thought, and he said, okay, how do you think you can get down? She said, well, I could do this or I could do this. He said, okay, why don't you try one of those? So sure enough, she got down on her own. So we like to jump in and save our kids a lot, but when we do this, we don't teach them how to think, how to problem solve. So I thought that example was a good example of how even a 4 or 5-year-old could learn critical thinking and not just be given the answer.
Yeah, that's a wonderful example because you're right. Too often, in the spirit of time efficiency, and moving things along, we don't realize that we're robbing our kids of opportunities to
Yeah.
learn if we could just slow down a bit and ask them, which is another one of your chapters that was so good too, about asking questions and not being the answer person for them. And again, those to me come over beautifully into the workplace for leaders there because the same thing can happen. In the spirit of saving time, it's easier sometimes to give the answer instead of saying, well, what options have you considered so far? You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
and teaching people to not come to you with a problem unless they have had
Yeah.
that time to think through and they already have some options of what they're considering, the one they would recommend doing, and just need to get you to sign off on it versus coming and saying, well, what do you think I should do?
Exactly. That happens so much. And sometimes my wife is a great leader, right? John Maxwell hired her when she was 25. So she's an excellent leader. But sometimes we have these conversations at the end of the day, and she said, everyone was in my office and they were asking me questions. And I said, so did you ask them how they would solve it? Well, no, because it was just we were under a time delay. I said, okay. I said, but just know that when you keep doing that, they're going to keep doing that, right? So when you empower people, it does take more effort initially. And it doesn't make you feel as good now because you're not the super boss that has all the answers that they depend on, but you are empowering to think on their own so that they don't knock on your door all the time and bug you with their
Mhm.
issues because you've taught them how to think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, you end up saving yourself time in the long run, gaining
Yes.
some time
Yes.
back. Well,
Yes.
one of the things you referenced, and I want to come back to it as kind of our closing thing, is one of the things you do in your programs for kids is you have these peer-led, team-oriented projects that you feel is really important and valuable in helping them develop their leadership skills. Talk about that structure and why it's important, because again, I think it carries over to the workplace really nicely.
Well, all of our curricula are based on really peer-led projects, right? It's project-based. It's learned by doing. You don't learn leadership from a book or a lecture, right? Here I am, a lecturer of leadership, but I know you don't really learn how to lead from my lectures. But if we put them in projects where they're leading their peers, and their peers could be siblings or could be friends, neighbors, but if you take the authority figure out, right, the adults, the teacher, the parent, those are the authority figures. So when you're an authority figure in the room, they're going to look for you for answers and they're going to depend on you. But when it's peer led, 2 things happen. First of all, students get familiar with being led by another student. So they realize, hey, someone my age can lead me in this activity. We can accomplish this together. And that's empowering. But the second thing is when you're in charge of your peers and there's an adult who's not going to take over, there's an adult who is not going to hijack it and become the leader. Now it rests on me. And so you build their confidence that way. So it's really a win-win. And even like in parent situations, we in our course train parents how when you empower your child to lead, you can't take over, okay? You can ask them Socratic coaching questions, but basically you become a follower. And so I think it's good for them too to realize that, hey, mom and dad can follow me as well. And just a note there is that we take turns in our curriculum of wearing a leader lanyard because what we find is that the more natural leaders, they'll always want to take over. And we call that hijacking. We see it in adults, we see it in kids, where someone who's a natural leader cannot follow well. Well, some of the best lessons of natural talented leaders is to learn how to be a good follower. So we train that as well because if you can't follow well, you really can't lead well. And you'll also always be one of those autocratic, dictatorial, if I can't lead, I'm not going to quit. You have a little hissy fit. So good leaders are also humble and they can be good followers. So that sort of exchange of the leader lanyard gives them all an opportunity to lead and to follow. And the parent is really just a coach to make sure that that happens well.
So great. I love that you brought up that whole thing of learning to be a good follower too, so that you don't think I'm always going to be the one that's going to have this leadership role, but that willingness to see the value and the benefit of others and what they have to contribute. That to me is another whole part of that leadership journey, being aware of others' contributions and strengths.
And Meredith, I know your philosophy of leadership. It's really servant leadership. The leader is there to serve others, not to be served by others. And so what we want to do is to teach them early that it's about being a servant. And it's interesting when we were working in the Middle East in Dubai, our host there said, "Well, no one aspires to be a servant." I said, "Well, in your culture, do you aspire for humility?" "Oh, yeah, yeah, humility we like." So I said, "Well, however we translate it, I think all around the world, we like leaders who are humble and leaders who can wash feet, not just be washed by others."
Good point. Alan, is there anything else from your book that you wanted to bring up or anything else about your work with parents and these kids that we haven't talked about that you'd like to share with my listeners today?
I think the biggest thing is in our course, KidLead Academy, it's like 7 hours of videos and online work, along with some curricula that they get. I think what that does is it empowers their child to develop their leadership potential. But some parents think, well, I don't have a doctorate in leadership. I'm not a leader. The cool thing about learning about leadership is that there are so many side effects, like confidence, like self-efficacy, like people skills. One of the things we see with Gen Z, 12 and up now, is that their people skills have come down because they have so much screen time. Well, leadership is a social art. So leaders are social architects. So their social emotional intelligence will go up, meaning they'll be a better team member. So even if your child never becomes a CEO like your 10-year-old granddaughter will be, they can still have great people skills, teamwork skills, critical thinking skills. So don't think that leadership training is just for the CEOs. It's really for everybody because we also want to teach people how to discern good leaders from bad ones and how to be a good team player.
Great. Thank you for that extra point. So, Alan, how can people connect with you, get a copy of your book, My Kid Leads, and learn more about you and your work that you're doing?
Well, you can go to kidlead.com, KID as in David, LEAD as in David.com, or leadyoungtraining.com for the free assessments articles. Or all my books are on Amazon. So you can go to Amazon and put in Alan E. Nelson or Kid Lead, and our books and workbooks will come up. I
Great.
can
And
quit
you're on
talking.
LinkedIn, so people can connect with you there.
LinkedIn, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook.
Great. Well, Alan, thank you so much for the work you're doing in the world. I just love that your focus is on helping young leaders and the impact you're having. And I appreciate all the contributions you've made through your writing, through your speaking, and your commitment. It just shines through. I love your enthusiasm, and I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation to hear how, the kind of impact that I know is possible for both the parents and the kids and future people in the workplace. So thank you for being with me today.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to my podcast. Now head over to growstrongleaders.com and check out the powerful tools we've created to help leaders strengthen their character and communication skills. Until next time, I'm Meredith Bell.